Hi everyone, welcome to the October 25th edition of the TimeformUS Pacecast. I'm David Aragona here with my usual co-host Craig Mulkowski, and this week we're looking back at last weekend's racing from around the country. A relatively slow weekend in racing. We did have some graded stakes action at both Keeneland and Belmont at the Big A. We'll talk about those races in addition to some allowance and maiden races that are worth discussing from both of those tracks. We did have some allowance races at Keeneland that achieved some pretty high speed figures, as well as some impressive maiden winners among the 2-year-olds from both of those venues, Kentucky and New York. We'll then move on to some other venues that we don't often touch upon. Finger Lakes, we saw an exciting edition of the New York bred Breeders' Futurity all the way back on Monday. At Delaware Park, we saw an allowance race in the middle of the week that achieved a pretty high speed figure. And then we'll finish things up with a 2-year-old race from Maryland Millions Day at Laurel. Craig, though, it's a bit of a lull in the racing calendar as we do await the Breeders' Cup, which now is less than 2 weeks away. I think we're just 11 days out from the Breeders' Cup, or maybe 10 days out from that Friday card. So a lot to look forward to on the racing calendar in the upcoming weeks, but obviously some of the top barns and top horses are not going to be in action until that Breeders' Cup card in early November.
We saw some pretty good performances last week, I think. But you're right. I mean, obviously not loaded with stakes action. I imagine next weekend's going to be even slower than this week. It's usually one of the slowest weeks on the racing calendar. But like I said, I do think we saw some pretty good performances. And a couple horses that we previewed on DRF are probably going to run back according to connections in the Breeders' Cup. So it wasn't a totally Breeders' Cup free weekend.
Yeah, these days it's pretty rare to see actual preps for the Breeders' Cup take place just 2 weeks before the race, or just 14 days out, actually, both of those races at Keeneland on Saturday. But I think it's possible. Steve Asmussen had said coming in to both the Raven Run and the Perryville that he was thinking about running both of his horses back. So we'll see if that does actually take place. Pre-entries have been drawn for the Breeders' Cup. I think they're going to be officially released on Wednesday, so we'll wait to talk about those for another couple of episodes. But Craig, let's look back at those two races that could possibly serve as Breeders' Cup preps from last Saturday at Keeneland. The feature was the Grade 2 Raven Run for the 3-year-old fillies going 7 furlongs. And Wicked Halo, who I know you kind of had an inkling might go favorite here, she did go off as the favorite and just dominated this affair, winning her 4th stakes in a row. She's just been in great form for Steve Asmussen.
She was favored, but she wasn't heavily favored, and that kind of took me by surprise, really. It's 7 and change, and I say the change very loosely at Keeneland because you get all your change there. Wasn't too bad for a horse that completely dominated this field. I mean, she never looked like a loser during the running. She just stalked from her outside post position, matched her speed figure from last time with a 1:15, and, you know, if she was to show up in the Breeders' Cup, I think you would have to take her pretty seriously because I don't think this was her A game even. She just, it looked like a paid workout to me.
Yeah, she is just a 3-year-old, so those 1:15 speed figures are pretty solid for a horse, even towards the end of her 3-year-old season. She's really taken a step forward, and she's shown that versatility with regard to distance, where she can be effective going 6 furlongs, as she was in the Prioress. She did win that stakes 3 back at Churchill going a mile, but it seems like this 7-furlong distance is right in the sweet spot for her, and we saw her deliver a nice performance on Saturday. Craig, I do want to mention the runner-up, Fingal's Cave, that New York bred, who did suffer her first career defeat here, but I thought she actually gained stature in her loss because she got off to a pretty rough start, was much farther back than I think anybody expected in the early going, and she put in a nice late run to get up for second here.
Unfortunately for me, she did put in a nice late run as I had an 8-9 exacta in this race. Per our preview, I actually really like that. But Fingal's Cave ran very well. She dropped well back, which is something we hadn't really seen for her. Maybe the routes had dulled her speed a little bit, but she was flying at the end. She was no threat to the winner, but she showed she's a really nice New York bred.
And I know this was a race that looked like it had a lot of pace on paper. It didn't necessarily materialize. The 46 half mile was solid, but it definitely didn't cross over the line into being a fast pace or anything close to that. So no real excuse for Smash Ticket, who was the other one that took money in here. She set that pace. It was a pressured pace, but she was just empty by the time they got to the quarter pole, and she kind of fell apart. So do want to give that credit where it's due to Fingal's Cave for making the run that she did from last up to second, given the fact that the pace was not that fast fast and was not really setting up the horse to make a run from that far back. So I think the top two both ran well. Not sure that I'd really want anybody else coming out of this race if they were to try a tougher spot in the future. Let's move on to the other stakes for 3-year-olds on Saturday at Keeneland. That was the Perryville run a little bit earlier in the day. This one, a stakes of the ungraded variety. And another Steve Asmussen trained progeny of Gun Runner getting the job done here as Gunite won another stakes. I think this was his 4th victory in his last 5 starts, with the only loss during that time coming to Jack Christopher in the Grade 1 Alan Jerkins at Saratoga. And Craig, just another Asmussen runner who seems to really be peaking towards the end of his 3-year-old season.
Another powerhouse performance. He ran a 124 TimeformUS speed figure, which basically matches his last 2 starts. He's just been really good. When he's lost, he ran into the very good Jack Christopher in that middle race, and just seems like one who I wouldn't be surprised if he shows up for one of the Breeders' Cup races. I'm not sure which one they're pointing for. He's just in rare and good form, and one that I look forward to seeing in a couple weeks if he does in fact enter.
Now, the Breeders' Cup Filly and Mare Sprint seems a pretty wide open race. I guess Wicked Halo would still be a little bit of a long shot if they tried her in there. Gunite, though, I think they're looking mostly at the Breeders' Cup Dirt Mile. If he were to come back in a race like that, I think he'd have to take his chances pretty seriously, because these mid-120 speed figures that he's earning put him right in line with horses like Cyberknife among the 3-year-olds, and even some of the older horses that are pointing for that race. It's not like they've been running much faster than that, so I think if Gunite does wheel back in the 2 weeks, he's one that you do have to take seriously.
You do. You have to wonder about the 2 turns. I think he's only tried it, if he even tried it at all. I don't think he did, actually. He ran the extended route at Belmont where he didn't run very well. But that was as a 2-year-old. It was against Jack Christopher when that one was just really good and much better than everyone else. So I could see taking a shot.
The one other graded stakes that they ran at Keeneland this past week on Sunday was the Grade 3 Dowager, this one going 1.5 miles for the older fillies and mares. And Craig, I've got to say, when I saw the betting for this race, I was pretty surprised they didn't make Temple City Terror the favorite. This wasn't a race that we talked about from a handicapping standpoint, so I don't want to redboard this one on a horse that wasn't that big of a price, but she just looked pretty strong on paper coming in here, proven at the distance. The public did go for that 3-year-old filly for Todd Pletcher, who set the pace here, but Temple City Terror, she got the kind of setup that she needed, and she was just much better than these horses.
The betting was a little perplexing. I know this horse looked much the best on the TimeformUS speed figures, and she ran to it. She basically ran what she always ran, right around that 120 mark. She got a 119 for this effort. Won easily. The pace obviously didn't hurt it, as we have the fractions coded in red, but I don't think it mattered. She was just much better than this group, barring the fact they had like a dawdling pace and she dropped way back. Maybe it would have been tough, but she's always been pretty, shown some good tactical speed, and she's just a really solid filly, Grade 3 horse. It's about where she belongs. I think I read that she's going to be entered in one of the upcoming sales. With fillies or mares, that doesn't always mean they're going to be retired, so not sure what the future holds for her.
Yeah, she made a really impressive move around the far turn, just catapulting past the field to challenge for the lead by the time they got to the top of the stretch. She went from second to last to first in the blink of an eye in this race. And she did doing it when the race was sort of starting to fall apart. But after she made that move, she really powered away through the stretch. I think she ran her final quarter in sub 23. And to do that, going 1.5 miles after making that early move that she did on the far turn, I just think just speaks to the kind of form that she's in right now. I'd argue this might have been the best performance of her entire career. Not the strongest field in behind. Luck Money, who was second, is a horse that just does tend to settle for minor awards in her races. But just note the big gaps between runners going back through the first 5 finishers. I think that just speaks to the fact that Temple City Terror was pretty dominant in this race. Let's move on to another race from that Sunday card at Keeneland on the turf course, one that actually earned a slightly higher speed figure than Temple City Terror. I don't know if we mentioned Temple City Terror got about a 119, Craig. You had estimated that on the document that you sent to me, but Street Ready in the 5th race from Sunday ran a number that's probably going to be in the low 120s, and he's one that actually drew in off the also eligible list to run here, and finally got back to the winner's circle, had hinted that he had been in better form at Saratoga, and then took that next step forward to get the job done here.
He's in really good form. His one loss was to Bye Bye Melvin, a horse who's just running really well. I think he's one that's even being considered for a Breeders' Cup race, and he ran a very nice 123 speed figure on this day. I did mention Temple City Terror was a 119. That is official, as is this Street Ready 123, as I was able to finish them up last night. And he is just a really dangerous horse when he gets on the front end by himself. That one loss to Bye Bye Melvin, he was rated off of that horse in slow fractions, ran okay, but just couldn't run down a horse who's probably a little better than him. But when they use his speed, which I think they were kind of forced to do when he drew in from that outside post, he's really dangerous when left alone.
And this was a pretty solid allowance field. You had many runners in here that were dropping out of stakes races. It's one of these quintessential Keeneland allowance races that really is befitting of its a six-figure purse. And Street Ready, drawing in off that AE list, as you said, showed good speed from the outside. And I would argue that one of the factors that's really turned around his form has been this rider switch to Luis Saez. Previously, he had a rider on his back that wasn't always the most aggressive with him. Sometimes got him into some trouble, and Saez has just been more aggressive with this horse, using his natural early speed to get clear of fields early, and it's really worked for him in those last three starts, both of those at Saratoga and then this recent one at Keeneland. And I would think that they have to step him back up into stakes company next time out, because he's in that kind of form right now.
And one thing you brought up is that this was an allowance race, and we've talked about this a lot recently. Allowance races seem to be having kind of a renaissance, where because of the exploding purses, we saw big purses at Saratoga, we saw them at Churchill, we're seeing them again at Keeneland, Kentucky Downs. We're getting some really strong allowance races, and I think racing is better for it.
Let's talk about another one of those allowance races that achieved a pretty impressive speed figure going back to Thursday's card at Keeneland. This one was the 8th race on Thursday, going 1 1/8 for the 3-year-olds. And Craig, Trademark is a horse that you might remember I had some interest in very early in the year when we did some of our Derby preps or the stakes previews. He's one that I would always like to include somewhere in my picks at a huge price in those races at Tampa. He just never really took that next step forward, disappointed in multiple stakes races, but this horse suddenly woke up last Thursday at Keeneland. I don't know where this performance came from, but boy, was he impressive in victory.
I don't know where it came from either, and he did it from the far outside post. He ran a 121 speed figure. He got for the win, and I mean, it's not like he didn't beat good horses in behind him and beat them decisively. He beat Actuator, who had won one of the 3-year-old derbies. I think it was Indiana. He had beat Ethereal Road, who's had not a great, but a solid 3-year-old season where he basically shows up every time, wins the listed in grade 3 type stakes races. Creative Minister was in the field, nowhere to be found. So this was a strong effort. I don't know why the light bulb went on, but he's still a young horse, and maybe he's one to keep an eye out for.
And it's not like he won by just 3 3/4 lengths and horses in behind had trouble or that sort of thing. He was utterly dominant in this race. If you look at the pace, the first 2 fractions color-coded in red, and the 2 horses that, or I should say the 3 horses that were ahead of him in the early part of the race that he chased down to make that early blitz to the lead on the far turn, they brought up the rear here. The horses that were 1, 2, 3 early finished 12th, 11th, and 10th in this race. The pace completely fell apart, and he was the only one that was remotely involved in that pace that kept going at the end. Just a supremely impressive effort here, and if he can continue along these lines, he's a horse that deserves to be stepped back up into stakes company pretty soon. You have to wonder if a race like this is just simply a fluke and he can repeat it next time out, but this is a horse that had shown some promise and some ability early in his career, had trips and some issues in his races, getting rank, but maybe if they figured all that out, he can finally start to show the kind of true ability that he does have. Let's move on to one more race from Keeneland last week. This was a maiden event from their Saturday card. Twirled, a horse who had made her debut on the turf at Kentucky Downs, switched over to the main track for her second start and was pretty dominant here. She looked like the speed coming in a race where many of her rivals were first-time starters, and she just got to the front and widened from there.
It was a strong effort from her. She ran a 101 speed figure, did it as easily as could be. Certainly looked like maybe she prefers dirt, though. She didn't run bad at all on turf in her debut. So maybe she's just one of those versatile horses. But I'll leave the breeding to you, but no doubt about it, she's fast. Not sure how far she can go, but the way she was pulling away from this field was very impressive.
And it's kind of interesting to look back at that Kentucky Downs maiden race that she was coming out of, where she just barely lost, because both of the top two finishers that day have subsequently come back and significantly improved their speed figures. The horse that beat her, American Apple, is that horse that returned to win the Matron next time out in that 47-1 upset, improving her time form number by 20 points. And it's a bit of a different beast with Twirled coming back on the dirt next time out. I wouldn't say that it proves that the figure was wrong at Kentucky Downs or anything like that, but maybe just be one of those aberrant races where two horses maybe are just improving at the right time, and it certainly seems that way with Twirled. And I agree, she might be one that's actually better on the dirt. The one thing I would say about this race is there were a few first-time starters that finished in behind her that had some trips or just raced greenly and looked like ones that might benefit from this experience, particularly the 4th and 5th place finishers. She's Fancy, a Graham Motion trainee, just seems like one that's going to want to go longer distances. The number 5, Catskill Humor, is a horse that you might want to go back and watch the trip of. She was reacting badly to kickback on the backstretch, was just pretty green, advancing to make a middle move on the turn, had some traffic trouble. So just some horses that I think are going to do better for having this experience under their belts. But on this day, clearly Twirled was much better than everybody else.
I'm glad you mentioned the kickback because it has been very noticeable at Keeneland. And I think it's going to be something worth keeping an eye on as we move towards that Breeders' Cup.
Yeah, I've noticed it watching the replays, actually. You can see it in the visual. It's just a lot of kickback coming back on the backstretch, the far turn, all this dust flying in the air. The horses coming home in some of these races are just completely covered in dirt. So it certainly affects the runs of some inexperienced horses that are trying to run through it. I wouldn't say that we've seen a ton of traditional track biases at Keeneland, but kickback like we saw over the summer at Saratoga in a similar situation, it can affect certain horses, and it's definitely something that you want to be aware of. Let's move on to New York and talk about a few races from the Belmont at the Big A meet. Their feature race this past weekend was the Grade 2 Hill Prince on Saturday, a race that Craig and I had handicapped on the TimeformUS Forecast last week. And Craig, kind of like we had talked about a little bit, and I certainly know that I had been a proponent of this idea, post positions were going to be of utmost importance in this race, and drawing the rail definitely helped the eventual winner, Celestial City, though he did have a dicey moment at the start when he stumbled out of the gate, but his rider, Jose Lezcano, knew the way the track was playing, and he just glued himself to that inside rail until I think he had to go around one horse, and that proved to be the path to victory.
That made all the difference. He just stayed on that rail. He didn't panic when things didn't go well early. And it's not like the pace was super fast. It was solid, but it's not like it was falling apart or anything. The runner-up was right there on the pace all the way around. And just a really good ride from him. Celestial City got a 116, his best speed figure to date. Maybe some of that's because of the rail, but I would say it was counteracted a little bit by the trip. So just a good, solid effort from a horse, a 3-year-old who is moving forward as you would expect.
Yeah, I completely agree about Jose Lezcano's ride. He just made all the right moves in this race, but he also had the horse to take him there. And Celestial City is just one of these typical Shug McGahee runners that has been steadily improving with every start. It feels like he's finally starting to hit his peak now. He's a horse that sometimes in the past would be a little bit one-paced, not possess that turn of foot to really take you there when he found the holes, but it seems like since they've added the blinkers and he's gotten a little bit more experience in these stakes races, he's become a little more push-button, and he needed to be to get the right trip in this race. And, Craig, it's not like he just won this race barely by a neck or something like that. He just slammed the door on this field in the stretch, especially that final eighth of a mile. They slowed down a little bit on that far turn, and it kind of turned into a sprint to the finish. And I was looking up the Trackus stats. This horse ran his final eighth, according to Trackus, in 10.96 seconds. So really gave nobody else a chance to make a run into that. And there were some horses that were trying to close, especially on the outside, that looked like they were just spinning their wheels. So it might be a race you want to go back and watch for trips, horses that were trying to close or were wide on the turns, because there were definitely some that were compromised in this race.
And we do note that with the Timeform US speed figures, how fast he actually closed in this race. He made up, he was 4 lengths behind after 6 furlongs, won by over 2 lengths. So that final time figure of 112 was upgraded to the 116. And that's not always easy to do in a race where the pace is pretty solid. It just wasn't an overly slow pace. So strong effort from him for sure.
Let's move on to Sunday's card at Belmont at the Big A, where their feature was the listed stakes, Carl Place, going 6 furlongs, again for the 3-year-old males. And Craig, if you were a backer of Run Curtis Run at 3-1 in this race, you probably were ready to rip up your tickets after the start, as he was surprisingly in last place early after he kind of got squeezed back coming out of the starting gate. But again, a situation where the ride really made the difference, as Jose Ortiz just decided to ride this horse like he was Silky Sullivan, and it worked out.
Talk about not panicking. He really didn't. And this is a horse who's usually right up on or near the pace. And obviously things didn't go well at the beginning. He just dropped well out of it and was able to get the job done and actually run the best speed figure we've ever seen from him, a 116, the same as we saw from Celestial City. So really good effort from him. And now they know they have a more versatile horse than maybe they realized beforehand.
Yeah, and this was not a race that fell into the lap of a closer by any means. The pace was, I would say, even throughout. That very fast horse, That's Right, who always looked a little bit dicey to get the 6 furlong distance, he was setting the pace up front, but not going quite as fast as he's capable of. And it's not like this race fell to other closers. There were others who were pretty far back early, though not quite as far back as Run Curtis Run, who really couldn't make any impact from the back of the pack. And I was looking again up the track as figures for this race, and Run Curtis Run put in a final quarter that was nearly a full second faster than anybody else in this race, which just speaks to the fact that Jose Ortiz rode like he was in a different race than anybody else. And it worked out for Run Curtis Run on this day, a horse who had suffered some second place finishes recently, a bout of second-itis, but got back to the winner's circle here against the right field, and seems like one, like you said, that it's going to be useful to the connections to know he has this versatility moving forward. Let's move on to an allowance race that again achieved the same speed figure, 116, on the turf. This was an allowance race from Sunday, and we saw another good 3-year-old in action here as Steady On raced in second early, past the eventual leader in the stretch to get up. But Craig, kind of like the Hill Prince, which was run 2 races earlier, this was another race on the inner turf course at Aqueduct where it just seemed like saving ground was the key to success, and the winner did just that.
Yeah, I was going to say this one was actually Saturday, and I know you pointed out when we did this on the forecast, that rail, you were harping on it, and you were spot on. It was yet another good ride, this time for Irad Ortiz, and just a solid effort from Steady On. Not sure what the plan is with him going forward. He would have to get a little bit faster to be a stakes horse, but he's certainly moving in the right direction.
Yeah, and I would say, while this is an impressive speed figure for a 3-year-old, this is the kind of horse that I would be skeptical of moving forward, because he's now 2 for 2 in his last couple turf starts, going long since they stretched him out. And he got a very favorable pace setup when he broke his maiden 2 back. And then again here, he was helped greatly by his trip, saving ground early. If you're just doubting it, go back and watch the replay of this race, and you'll notice there are 4 out of the 8 horses that are on the rail for a good portion of this race, and they are the 4 horses that completed the superfecta here. Everybody else who was off the rail for a significant portion of this race just didn't seem to have that finishing kick, and the top 2 were the 2 Steady On and Java Buzz that were both on the rail and forward in this race, and that's what you really needed on this inner turf course while the rails were down. It will be a different situation next week at Aqueduct. Unfortunately, if you were looking to make some money betting this in the future, they've changed the rail settings for this upcoming week, so we hopefully won't have that same bias. But yeah, Steady On, definitely a trip-aided performance on Saturday at Aqueduct. One more race that we should talk about from that Saturday card, Craig, was a maiden race that kicked off that late pick 5 sequence on Saturday. That was won by the Todd Pletcher-trained 2-year-old first-time starter, Rudder's Men, a horse who had been highly touted coming in here off an impressive series of workouts, and he delivered in the afternoon.
He was fast, and unfortunately, this was a race we talked about. Once he was going off at 2-5, it kind of eliminated me from playing the pick five, especially when his main rival in here, Skellig, was scratched. So it kind of made it a paid workout, but he did everything right. He looked professional, he ran fast, and I'm not one that's big into the gear down, could have run faster, but this horse probably could have run faster.
Yeah, and I find it interesting they chose to debut him at 7 furlongs because, like you said, it seems like speed is the name of the game for this horse. He was very quick early, that first fraction, achieving a TimeformUS pace figure of 132. That's pretty quick for the distance, especially compared to the final time of this race. And the others that were chasing him early just were completely gassed by the time they got to the quarter pole, and that's the point at which he really opened up on this field. And some others did close from the back of the pack to get up for second and third here, well ahead of the fourth place finisher. So there were some gaps in behind him, and I think this was a more impressive victory than the 4 1/4 margin would suggest. I just wonder if this is really going to be a classic distance kind of horse. There's some speed on the bottom side of the pedigree. I think I'd mentioned last week the dam is a half sister to Yopon, the winner of the Grade 1 Forgo at 7 furlongs. So I get the sense this might be more of a speedball than a Kentucky Derby type, but we'll find out more about him in future starts. Let's move on to a few more races from different venues that achieved noteworthy speed figures this past weekend. Actually, earlier in the week at Delaware Park, we saw an allowance race on Thursday that was won by the 3-year-old Little Vic. And this was an exciting race to go back and watch, Craig, because the first and third place finishers here just put on this early duel. They hooked up basically right out of the start and dueled each other for almost the entire 6 furlong distance. One of them got tired at the end, but Little Vic was able to gut it out to get the victory here.
He's a horse who's been fast all along. He didn't run very well. I know we talked about him in the Gallant Bob as a horse who was likely to be a pace factor and just didn't really show up and do any running, but he certainly did here, as you say. He set that pace earlier, was right on the pace before dropping out. Here, he showed plenty of fight, dueling with Spike Zone, a horse who was his main rival, according to the bettors. And as you say, they really threw it down, and he won the battle and the war as he was able to hold off Radical Right pretty easily and run a career best speed figure for him, a 121. Some of that had to do with the pace. He got a pace upgrade of about 4 points, but he's a horse who's just really quick. Not sure what happened at Parks. I do think he is a horse who's capable in stakes races on his best day. He just hasn't really shown it yet, but I think one of these days he's going to pop one.
Yeah, when I was initially looking back at this race, I was a little skeptical of how well he ran, just beating Radical Right by a little over a length. That's a horse who has primarily been a turf sprinter in the past, but then when I went back and watched the race, I realized that they had been running in completely different pace situations, and Radical Right did not run only a length worse than Little Vic. Clearly, he's a horse that got the right kind of pace setup, whereas Little Vic did all the heavy lifting on the front end, so he ran really well on this day. It's just, like you were getting at, he's not a horse that's been reliable in stakes company in the past. I don't know if it's a Lasix issue or something, but he's just run all of his better races against allowance horses, so you wonder if he can finally take that step forward and run this kind of speed figure against tougher company. Let's talk about another race that was pretty exciting to watch from this past week, and that was going all the way back to Monday at Finger Lakes in the New York Breeders' Futurity, won by Acoustic Avenue. And Craig, there were 3 New York bred 2-year-olds in this race that really put on a show to the wire, as Acoustic Avenue was able to outduel both Andiamo a Firenze, who he beat by a nose, as well as the third place finisher Stonewall Star. These 3 were stacked across the track with an eighth of a mile to go, and it was just a real fight to the finish.
It's not often we talk about many races from Finger Lakes. I remember a fast allowance race a few months ago, but doesn't happen often. But these were some pretty good 2-year-olds. I know Andiamo a Firenze had the name from his win at Saratoga, and Stonewall Star had won a nice maiden race at Belmont with good speed figures. But Acoustic Avenue proved that he just continues to get better. He's now won, I think it is 3 out of 4 starts. He's improved his speed figure the last couple times and just seems like a really good sprinter. He also showed some gameness here, just basically battling with Andiamo a Firenze all the way around the track and able to fight that one off.
Yeah, I think this was a truer indication of where these two horses are at than when they faced off at Saratoga. Andiamo Firenze had obviously beaten Acoustic Avenue pretty decisively that day, but it was over a very sloppy track. I think that was the day before the Travers. Rail probably wasn't the place to be. Acoustic Avenue was drawn inside that day, so they put on a real show here over a fast track. It was an exciting duel between these two, as well as Stonewall Star, who you mentioned. They're three nice New York brides. I don't think that they're going to be super competitive at open company moving forward, but they definitely are above average for what we typically see in some of these Finger Lake Stakes races.
Yeah, and I forgot to mention the speed figure was actually a 96 for the winner and the runner-up in this spot.
Let's finish up by talking about one more state-bred two-year-old stakes race. That was the Maryland Million Nursery from the Maryland Million Day on Saturday at Laurel Park. And Johnny Z from Albany got the job done here. And just a horse that seemed to take a big step forward now in the fourth start of his career, showed improved early speed and just kept going on the front end.
I know our colleague Dan Illman will be happy we're talking about Maryland Million Day. He loves him some oral racing. He is a great follow if you like watching oral racing and betting on it, obviously. And yeah, this was a really nice effort. A big jump in speed figure all the way up to a 105. And watching the race, there's really not a whole lot to question about it. He just opened up on the field and ran a big race, drawing away, the margin getting bigger at every call, and was never really threatened at all.
He is by that Maryland sire Blofeld, who's had plenty of success in that Mid-Atlantic region. The dam on this one was actually a pretty good runner herself. She earned over $500,000, and she was twice a winner of the Maryland Million Lady Stakes. So there was definitely a Maryland Million connection here for Johnny Z from Albany's pedigree. And just seems like he's one that's really hitting his stride now towards the end of his two-year-old season. So certainly one to watch in this company moving forward throughout the winter in Maryland.
Maryland Million Day always reminds me of just how old I'm getting, because I was at the very first one, and it was one of the highlights of my racing fandom. It was one of those days where King Swan showed up and actually ran in the sprint at the time. And, it wasn't the days where there was a lot of simulcasting or anything like that. So to go see a horse like that in person in Maryland was really cool. And I remember he delivered the goods. I don't want to look up at how many years ago it was that the Maryland Million's been around. But for a guy who's from there, it's good to see it still going strong. And there were a lot of good performances on Saturday, not just this one.
Yeah, obviously I wasn't around back then, but I remember the name of King Swan. I think he ran third in that three-horse Whitney behind Personal Ensign, so I'm guessing that was sometime in the mid to late 80s. But I kind of wish I could have been around at that time, because that just seemed like it was the heyday of racing, large fields, racing action, top-level racing action happening at so many different tracks. I sometimes regret that I couldn't experience that, but definitely good to remember those hardy horses from the past.
Yeah, and last thing, for those who aren't familiar with King Swan, if you're younger like David, look him up on Equibase and check out his running record. It's really cool to see just how sturdy horses can be. And if memory serves, he was actually a claimer at one time and worked his way up the ranks and became a graded stakes winner, and was just a really cool horse that had a huge following on the NYRA circuit.
Well, everybody, thanks for listening to the podcast this week. Just to do a little bit of housekeeping, Craig and I will be discussing the Breeders' Cup races probably next week on our Pacecast. I think we'll do a little bit of a preview at that point. We will do our typical TimeformUS forecast this week, looking ahead to some weekend racing. Craig, I haven't done too much looking at the stake schedule. I know there are a few stakes planned on Saturday in New York. I think Sunday is their New York Bred Showcase Day. And I'm assuming there's going to be some kind of stakes action at Keeneland, though I haven't looked ahead at the schedule, but I'm sure we'll find an interesting pick 5 sequence to talk about.
Yeah, it'll be tough to tear me away from those Breeders' Cup pre-entry PPs, but I'm sure we'll be able to find something worth analyzing and hopefully coming up with a winning ticket.
Yeah, certainly a lot to talk about with regard to the Breeders' Cup, and we'll get there eventually, but don't want to get ahead of ourselves just yet. Everybody, thanks for listening to the podcast this week. Remember, you can always catch these podcasts on DRF.com, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. Wherever you get your podcast, just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. And before we go, I should mention, if you're looking for some Breeders' Cup content, I probably should have mentioned this a little bit earlier, but I will be doing a live video with Marcus Hirsch in a couple days. I believe it's on Thursday, where we'll be talking about some of the Breeders' Cup pre-entries. So you can just make sure to look out for that on Daily Racing Form social channels. If you want to get your Breeders' Cup fix in a little bit early, just make sure to check that out. And Craig and I, of course, will discuss the races, as I said, next week. So again, everybody, thanks for listening to this podcast, and make sure to catch that TimeformUS forecast coming up on Friday.